that we have with Black creatives here in the Portland area and beyond. I'm super happy, along with Jeff Oliver and Rashonda Brooks, to talk with you guys about sort of production work and in the city of Portland and beyond. And we have Donielle Howard, a good friend of mine and colleague, working here in Portland in various different capacities, creative and otherwise. I've known Donielle I've known of Donielle much longer than I've known her personally and worked together, but probably for about 5 years, maybe a little bit more. But she is a stalwart of the production community here and has worked with is part of the Labs family, I would like to say. Has worked a lot with Dustin Tolman, who's a former fellow in the pilot year, and Sika Stanton, she's worked with quite a bit, who's also a former fellow. But yeah, I'm excited to talk with Donielle about her experience. I have some very particular questions about her experience and production in general. But yeah, introducing Donielle Howard.
Hi, thanks so much, Ifani. It's great to be here with you and Open Signal. I'm excited to talk a little bit about my experiences in production and sort of I prepared a little sort of introduction, and then I'll lead into a video that is a kind of a cool conversation starter that'll, it's pulled from a discussion where I was talking about, production and social justice. Because I think when I discuss my work as a producer, directing and branding, commercial work, animation, nonprofits, before even I think about the creative or explaining the production process, my mind goes to questions of leadership style, gender, and race, which is so much a part of my experience. So, rather than outlining the process say like breaking down a script or creating a production plan or what it takes to hire crews to bid a project, the first and foremost effort in my career, it's been about 20 years of production work, has been to that my process really has to center around creating space for myself from which I can act as an authority in the first place. It's funny, I was struck this morning watching Democracy Now! There was a quote from Pauli Murray, who's a Black and transgender activist, poet, lawyer, Episcopalian priest, and saint who died in '85. And there's a quote from her that says, I'm gonna read it: "My whole personal struggle has been to meet standards of excellence in a society which has been dominated by the ideas that Blacks were inherently inferior to whites and women were inherently inferior to men." And as someone who's usually, I usually am the only or one of the few Black women in any space I enter in my media work often. As a producer, I'm expected to work from and hold an authority over projects and budgets and clients and crew members in a world that sort of inherently sort of sees me as inferior, and in both subtle and overt ways. Each project means finding a way to hold and exert power within systems that inherently distrust or reflect or resist and discredit authority in a lot of ways. So as I look back, I note that at different stages of my own personal development and sense of empowerment as a Black woman, I've had different levels of confidence and ability to navigate this dynamic. And that journey has provided me a real interesting plethora of data to pull from in the discussion of representation, social equity, and inclusion across like branding, advertising, entertainment, finance, and even nonprofit work. And so it's very interesting, and I bring this up because in the current zeitgeist, where issues of social justice are being incorporated into, the media narratives by popular demand, I find it interesting and a challenge to find a way not only to bring an authentic voice to the projects I take on, but also generate a generative production process as well. And the power to do so is like often limited within systems, but I always am challenging myself to find a way to set those limits, push those limits while setting reasonable goals, engaging in self-care, protecting my mental and physical health, and creating systems from which others coming up behind me can benefit. So like I said, I'll start by showing an overview of my story in this video as a conversation starter, and maybe talk further and hear your questions and go from there. So Just bear with me while I share my screen and get the video going. And I'll see you in about 15 minutes. I experienced the intersectionality of those two terms, those two concepts in my life as a Black woman who's the child of activists, who is in media and spent the last 19 years in producing branding content for companies and nonprofits, that my experience as a producer, as a manager, as a project manager, as someone in a leadership role has always been a matter of social justice. Being the embodiment as, you know, a marginalized person, there's no way for me to experience that space without experiencing it from a social justice perspective. The challenges I have experienced as a producer all have to do with my race, my gender, and my whole approach is informed by the challenges that I've had to live through within this capitalist system, within this political system, within educational systems. I feel like my whole life in the last 20 years, I have data from a time when these conversations were not overt at all, when social justice was not even on the plate societally in a real way, especially within management systems, right? So I feel like my experience has always been speaking to a bottom line directive, but facing challenges for coming from a leadership style that was not acknowledged in any system in which I found myself. The challenge of my experience has been in the separation between the initiatives, these buzzwords, I call them the check boxes, right? And the on the ground processes that often and pretty consistently work against those very initiatives, right? Those very check boxes. It's delivering a project with DEI initiative goals that exploits and perpetuates the very checkbox it is trying to address. It just becomes another vehicle for the same oppression. It's very ironic to experience that the language, the checkboxes themselves become the vehicle for the same oppression. Think about an experience I had with a brand where it was an environmental installation, giant pieces that were going to be mounted in an office, in a wall. It was out of the country, and one of the initiatives that we were tasked with fulfilling was hiring Indigenous people to create this work. Because of the production process, not enough time was allotted for it. Purposefully, when we had 9 months, decisions were put off, budget was denied and reduced for this people. We were only sort of greenlit on being able to move forward at a moment in the schedule when we were forced to hire 10 times more people at a lower rate than would have been acceptable had we followed my leadership. My voice as a Black woman, I felt, was very easy to suppress and ignore in that space. And we ended up paying people about 15 cents an hour to deliver something on a rush. And this was to fulfill a directive that Indigenous people should be benefiting from this installation. And it turned out to exploit them in a way that would have been worse than not having them participate at all. And to be producing that on the ground and be the conduit of that, there was no way I could reduce the harm within that system. And that taught me a lot about these initiatives. It was a checkbox. Literally, there's a plaque next to the piece calling out that initiative for a pat on the back for the company. And that's that example to me. It shows how that's the danger of not stepping back, not addressing what needs to really change at core fundamentally in order to fulfill the initiative. When it's just a checkbox, it's an instrument of the same oppression. I felt it in my physical being, the nausea, the stress of being forced to work in a style and pay people in a way that ran counter to everything I believe in. I feel like my production philosophy is very much, I see myself as a filter between the directive and my crew and my team, and I feel very protective of them. I feel like sustainability is a huge part of my leadership style. I don't believe in burning people out. And so in that experience specifically, I could not filter. And then just the psychological insight and understanding, I mentioned earlier, being the child of activism and social justice has always been in my head as being the context for my work experience, for my life experience, and seeing the way in which I was personally the vehicle of exploitation in a place that, like, I really used to believe that, like, by being placed in these systems, I could change things. I could at least do things differently. But in that instance, it was so clear to me that power is limited, that there's not much I can do to change when my job is to deliver. And if I don't deliver, that has ramifications for my personal life and for the way others who come behind me are seen. It's a lot of pressure that manifests physically in terms of burnout, stress, depression. I experienced all those things from having to live and embody and act in a way that runs counter to my beliefs in order to deliver a bottom line goal that I did deliver to. And there's mixed feelings about that, coming in on time and under budget in that kind of way. It takes something from you. We locate social justice on our bodies, right? Like I'm filtering the negativity through my body. I'm filtering the language, and I'm being used because I can, this face can speak to Indigenous peoples with a different level of trust than another face might be able to. So, my body is a location of not only the challenge of being seen as a checkbox, right? My authority as a leader is compromised by this view of my being some sort of physical embodiment of DEI. You know what I mean? Oh, we've got a Black producer, we've got a female XYZ, being used in that way. Not only runs counter to social justice, but my successes mean that the system is validated as being normal. I've seen the non-sustainability of these approaches, like, yeah, delivered on time and under budget, but who did you lose from your team who moved on to a different job? You know what I mean? Who quit in the middle? And who did you have to spend 4 weeks replacing, retraining? These are the things that don't get even counted into the bottom line that I think is really interesting. There are companies I've worked for, just trying to bring in vendors, like, oh, I won't work with those guys because of past experiences, and having to use my interpersonal skills to draw them back if I need that vendor to work, if I need that individual, that animator. It's not about individual bodies. I feel like, I want to throw the idea of leadership styles into the conversation as well, because you can have a body that is brown, that is Black, that is female, that is, whatever, checkbox you want to fill, who apes the same leadership styles and perpetuates it that way. That you can be non-sustainable and be of color. You could be an instrument of injustice and be female. You know what I mean? I think the style and core values are really where the change has to happen. I feel like maybe the only way would be to create other systems that work in a way and that are seen as receiving these rewards of that sort of more sustainable approach, losing your employees to other companies that are doing things differently, and then being motivated from a desire. Maybe it's still out of that fearful place, but it's shifted slightly differently to at least embracing the idea that sustainable production styles are more attractive, sort of organically become more interesting and attractive value systems, and need to be revisited and spoken honestly about.
There's a lot in there. That was comprehensive, and I think I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think it resonates for me. I think it resonates for what Labs has been trying to do. I'm excited to sort of dive right into some of the details and specifics of this kind of work and working in this environment. One of the analogies I like to use when talking about what Donielle has very personally and thoroughly explained is the sort of a perpetuation of systems, and being a part of a system that forces us to acclimate to a system that doesn't allow us to change. It's like, there's two examples that I like to use. And one is the example of the Matrix, right? I know it's, cliche or whatever, but we're in a system that perpetuates our actions as a tool of the system in and of itself. And Frantz Fanon talks about this a lot in the book Wretches of the Earth, in that there being structures and frameworks within our society that account for the resistance of those who are subjugated. So this idea of protest, right? Protest is a function of the system, the First Amendment, the ability to say what you want to say, and what we see in terms of protesting and the idea of nonviolence. Like, all those ideas are designed to give people an illusion that we can change the system, when in fact, that whole ideology is about a maintenance of the macro system. So so I know Donielle understands that. I know that a lot of the people on this call understand that. I know some of the people that we work with understand it. The question is, how do we break the cycle? What are the tools that we can use and develop that acknowledge the system that we're in, that can then lead to us eventually breaking or creating something new? And the second analogy is one of like radioactivity. Picture a farmland, right? And the dirt and the soil have been are toxic. Maybe there's been nuclear waste. Sure, they've remediated the soil. It's arid, and people have begun to plant crops, right? And those crops are designed to help people. But because of past action, that land is still infertile. I mean, things can grow, but do you want to eat what is grown from that? Probably not. I mean, is it as radioactive as it was 20 years ago? Probably not. But do you want to eat it anyway? So the intent of growing crops on this land is similar to us trying to build systems that empower Black people in a radioactive space. So what are our choices? It seems almost like we are kind of we're kind of facing a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. We can continue to plant seeds in this land, in this space, in this area, but is that really going to contribute to the liberation of Black identity, culture, freedom, or is it going to continue to make us sick? So, and Donielle, we've worked together a couple of times, and I know that we are always trying to be aware of these things, either when working with clients and their own expectations. I feel like there's some safety in numbers, so to speak, even if it's just, you, myself, maybe one other Black person or whomever who understand these dynamics. Is that part of what we do? Is engaging in conversations like this and trying to share our experience with other people? Would that be enough, or are we still eating toxic food in a sense? Are we still growing toxic crops?
You've covered a lot of really interesting key points that I have like pondered in so deeply, just because they are, they're personal questions as someone who occupies the space I do within production. Riffing on your last point about like, our work together and the safety in numbers, and how do we empower Black people in a radioactive environment, a historically radioactive environment. I think one thing I find that space is very different, and the production style is always unique and a whole different scene when I'm dealing with the majority Black production.
Yeah.
It just automatically is a different foundation. This is just my personal experience, but working Black people, I don't have to deal with a lot of most of the problematic issues I have to deal with in mainstream, spaces. So I think part of how we empower Black people is by producing our own projects, not only being the subject matter in front of the camera, but being behind the camera, being the production team, being the financer, all of those things. When a project is, intrinsically Black and Black run, it's a very empowering position to be in. And I find there's definitely a fluidity in production. And, I'm not saying that like, oh, Black people are perfect, Black people create perfect. No, but I'm just saying there is an intrinsic and automatic effortlessness of respect in a certain way. It's easier to be heard. Things don't get challenged in a certain way, so I think part of, the answer to the question is in terms of empowerment really does mean, being in positions and empowering ourselves to create our own work and working together. I think there is a certain safety in numbers in that way. There's a critical mass. I've even had people, one of the first nonprofit jobs I did in Oregon, under my own shingle, I went out of my way to, I was going to be filming at-risk women, many of whom were of color, most of whom were of color. And I thought it was really important for people who, were going to be in front of the camera for the first time to be able to see people who look like them behind them. So I had a mostly Black crew, and, the white people who were involved in the production, one of whom was a sound person, one of whom was like a co-production entity that, it was very interesting the way that, they marked, this is the most smoothly running production I've been on in a long time. Wow, this is really a special space you've created. And, I thought it was interesting in the shock and surprise that, like, sort of, I could see the dots being connected in a certain way. Like, I don't know what their expectations were walking into an all-Black set or an all-Black situation, but by setting up a space that honored my subjects in a way that I had to very overtly work towards, in terms of, creating comfort levels, with the, people who didn't understand what I was doing because I was working in a way they weren't used to, flipped and, sort of turned around and at the end pulled me aside to talk about how positive the experience is for them. So I think there is something not just, defensive about, working amongst other, we can elevate systems and processes by working in a way that is outside of white supremacy, point blank to use that word, like, white supremacy is imbued in the media, even in the sense of like the history of film and technology, you know what I mean? Like, D.W. Griffith I was learning in film school that he's the father of American cinema, So it's like, it's just, one of the first, what is it? What was it? Al Jolson and, what was it? The jazz singer? Blackface was like, the first time we ever saw music in sync with talking.
Paul Robeson and Oscar Michaud, yeah.
And Michaud made, what was, I can't remember the name of the film he made in response to Birth of a Nation, but like there's so much of the conversation in media, and especially the technological aspect that media represents that has been sort of kept away, the technology, which is now like, easier for people to access, on their phones, you can make a movie or whatever. But when I went to film school in the 90s, it was a mystery, and I think it is still, a mystery to a lot of people. So, there's a way in which the spaces we create as people of color in the industry, you know, there's something not only that is good for ourselves, but good for the whole industry. And then to the, you know, how can we break the cycle, you know, in terms of the very systems that we find ourselves in when we're, you know, if you're working in media or entertainment or, you know, any system that's outside of ones that we create. I feel like that one, you know, I just feel like, you know, I've been 20 years in production, you know, since, you know, I came out of film school. And I think a major key factor is time. How do we do it is bit by bit. Like, I don't think I'm going to witness, you know, any huge major changes in my lifetime, right? You know, I've definitely sort of tempered my understanding of what I can do, you know, from, you know, my 20-year-old self to, you know, I'm 53 now, my 53-year-old self, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like what I can do, you know, and how I break the cycle is by continuing to stand in my truth in the situations I find myself in production, speaking truth to power and creating and you know, whatever systemic changes and systems I can create. But I think, you know, I think one of the ways we do that is by taking care of ourselves and understanding that, like, we're each, you know, a link in the chain, and it's going to take time before, you know, that radioactive earth is not going to be purged overnight. You know what I mean? It's going to have to, you know, it might be 100 years, might be 1,000 years, or, you know, might have to create some new earth, or, you know, but it's not going to be immediate. And I think that tempers, you know, sort of my impatience and my frustration in my own personal experiences, just knowing that, like, it's going to be a long time.
One of the things, and I definitely other people to, you know, jump in with questions and ideas. But one of the things that I have to grapple with myself is the recognition that, well, for one, here in Portland, you know, there's something we can do here that is going to have a significant impact on the people that we see and interact with directly. You know, when it comes to national, international distribution, huge, you know, studios and Hollywood and, you know, those kind of things, I think that is not unachievable to impact those systems. But I think there's in our community here, that's obviously where we have to start in a certain sense, or we have to begin to model and to create things on a small scale that can then be scalable. The other part of that, which is challenging, I think, Donielle, you mentioned it, you know, earlier, both in, you know, when you were introducing your video piece, but you talked about being able, like, how do you work within that system? And when we talked about that kind of like overarching sort of matrix of control, but there's also a certain reality that I've had to come to terms with, and that is the simple concept that it doesn't matter how it gets done in terms of justice, it just has to get done. So if a big company says, you know, and you mentioned someone on the set of one of a project that you were working on that was all black, and then being, wow, this was amazing, I didn't know it could be that great. And if that perspective, you know, goes, and they take that back to a client or, you know, the marketing department or the president of whatever company they're working for, and then they say, oh, you know, and they sort of invest in that as a means of their own personal enrichment. But the result of the work is that more Black people are getting employed, more Black people are expressing themselves, and the resulting project is more representative of the truth. It's not this company doing it because they believe it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because it's affecting their bottom line. But it still has an impact on people when it comes to representation, justice, and fairness. So my usual position is like, I want people to be like, you need to learn that this is how things go, and you need to atone for this, and you need to understand that history has done this to me and my people. That's important. I do believe in like justice in that sense, but we can't ignore the impact of the work that it is that we are doing. It's not either or, it's both. You know, it's a double, we have to take this from both ends to a certain extent. but I've always been sort of so focused on the root of the problem, like, and I think that's important. Like we definitely shouldn't keep planting things in the same soil. Maybe we should look for different fertile land in the area, but I think it's important to realize that it's not all or nothing. And I think Black Americans in particular, who have been under the boot for such a long time and have been continually frustrated in terms of how we participate in our political system, how we participate in our economic system, how we participate in our creative economies, like all of that, I completely understand and I express it myself. But I think we have to acknowledge that it's not necessarily how it gets done, just has to happen. And so I think all the work that we were doing here in Portland, I think is a good example of that. And I just wanted to ask you, Donielle, before I sort of open it up to other folks and so on. But is there any project that you've worked on recently here in Portland that you feel like is a stepping stone to something like that? It may not have been like the most ideal set of circumstances, but are there things that you are working on now or have worked on in the past that are like, yeah, all right, this was new, this had an impact. This is not necessarily like planting seeds in the same radioactive soil. This is like somewhere down the road. Is there something that you see coming down the road or have worked on?
It's funny. I'm thinking of a project that I'm wrapping up now for a nonprofit. I'm doing a piece for the Meyer Memorial Trust around their new headquarters. Mm. And the video won't be coming out for probably another month or so. But that process I felt like was a really revolutionary one for me. It was a process where the marketing producer, that I was working with at Meyer is Black. The sort of the legacy of philanthropy that was left behind with Meyer by Fred Meyer was sort of open, right? He left it very open so that the board members would be sort of empowered to change the directive to whatever the times needed and provided. And so one of the things that's been happening the last couple of years, they've really sort of dug into, equity and the history of, this Portland as a whites only state. So I was able to really bring in the history of this state in an overt way that I've actually found very surprised. So, midway through producing, I realized, I'm not used to being able to be so open and clear and naming the history of racism and torture and oppression and exclusion in this state for a client, a voice of and it was I think it was probably one of the first time, I think it is the first time in my life outside of projects that I, do from, passion projects I've done for myself or with other like-minded people, but for a client, that was really encouraging to be able to do and to be able to sort of put their current work in the context of this state. And so I think by, in working on that project, I occupied a space that I've never really, and was able to work in a way, not in opposition to my client, but in sync with, so that was very exciting for me.
A different kind of collaboration, different kind of like working relationship, different kind of client creative, relationship.
Because I feel like, especially in my commercial and branding work, even in episodic, there's always a way in which, you have to, you talk about like, how you want, people to learn or want to deal with the systemic course, I've found ways to like, be subliminal, I'm always behind the scenes. So, the way I treat people, that's the way, or the way I produce is sort of like the progressive thing for me. But, being able to, now that conversation is happening in the zeitgeist and, there's a sort of a curtain pulled back on certain aspects of the reality of, sort of white supremacy in this country. I feel like now I don't have to, language things in a way that are not offensive to, you know, the majority population, or language in a way that isn't too Black or blah, 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 or isn't, you know, doesn't come across as too, you know, progressive. You know, I feel like there's something exciting happening where, you know, you can even say the word, you know, white supremacy without it being thought of as some imaginary thing that Black people made up to explain their inferiority, you know. So that's a huge thing, because it does, like I, you know, sort of alluded to in the video, and you know, is that like that assumption of inferiority just like is a real challenge to overcome. And when it's not even overtly part of the conversation, you know, it's a real crippling thing, you know. So being able to call us, you know, a spade, or speak, you know, openly, is I think definitely something that's happening in projects these days. And you know, and it needs to go even further. You know, we need to keep going, because I think really part of the systemic change is more and more ability to create our own content. And that means both in front of and behind the camera. Informing the gaze, you know, and once you know, are informing the gaze, being able to, with confidence, have that gaze be, you know, reflective of your full authentic experience rather than that little bit that is palatable to the mainstream audience, you know. That's what I would say.
Also, one thing, like, you don't have to inflate your age and experience. You can tell us that you're 33, 53, doesn't make any difference. Let's be real about it.
Right.
Sorry, Rashawn, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I know you kind of talked about this, but I am curious, like, other ways. Well, I'm curious, could you go a little further in the ways that you've also been able to, like, you know, leverage your power, or as they say, privilege, to, you know, help push, you know, Black content and progress it, and, you know, continue to build these spaces, as you said, you know, with other Black creatives, so we can create our own thing and have these sets where these vibes are good, and, you know, and stuff like that.
In terms of like creating content for other people coming up in film and video?
Mm-hmm. Or other ways you just found that you've been able to support other Black creatives?
I think it's really important to overtly make it a goal to hire Black people in my productions. That's, you know, always my goal is first and foremost to hire people of color in every position. You know what I mean? I've definitely like loved open signal as a resource on that level. Like you mentioned Ifani, you know, I work a lot with Dustin Tolman, and a lot of, you know, people who have been on my crews have been, you know, people who've been in the open signal program, right? So I think it's really important to, you know, to hire people who are, you know, coming out of open signal and pay them their rate. You know, I think, you know, when the real model that I took on, I do my passion projects, a lot of my nonprofit work or passion projects that I'm producing through my own, you know, production entity. And part of the model was that, like, you know, in order to, you know, I think in nonprofits, the budgets are often a lot lower, right? You know, and part of my way of handling that was, you know, I did not want my business model to be exploitive, right? Like to hire people at reduced rates out of that, you know what I mean? So part of, you know, Rashonda, your answer to your question is how I, you know, I feel like it's really important to me to you know, bring people into the fold, is that you pay people their rate. And that's part of like starting with a baseline of respect, you know what I mean? And one way I can manage doing that is like, you know, if I need to shorten a schedule, hey, we're going to churn this out in a week, and that's how we keep this budget tight. Or if I need to extend it, hey, we've got a lot of projects, so this is going to happen over a 3-month period. But whatever it takes in terms of my budgeting, it comes down to me, you know, fundamentally it has to be paying people their rate, because I feel like a lot of times as a person of color too, you're brought on with the expectation that you're going to, you know, work at a cut rate because, you know, this is an opportunity for you, you know. It's like, no, like I feel like that's, you know, sort of an inherently racist thing that I've always sort of encountered in my career a lot. The expectation that I'm supposed to lower my rate is something I don't want to pass down systemically at all. So I guess, so, that's a big deal in terms of, what you're talking about. And I think the other part is just sort of when I do have projects, especially ones that like, I'm not it is a client, that, I am working for an agency or within another production company. I feel like a lot of times my onus is to, like, when there are people of color who are, the subjects of the film, always, that's when I've had, a couple of different experiences of having to work and be a strong voice of like, okay, we are not filming them in X way, we're filming in this way. You know what I mean? Understanding, there's a way in which, I think that sort of white gaze, there's no way for them to, for white people who are used to a certain production style or process, they can't analyze their own bias, right? So I think I've had to be, in a couple of different instances, very strong about, no, that's not the way we're doing this. And really drawing the line. There is one project, I think, it actually is the same one I was talking about before, where, one of the client producers, he felt it was very important that we get tears from these clients in order to really sell the authenticity of this, video. And, just the line of questions that, the interviewer I was interviewing, that we wanted to add to the interview list was, I think, I'll say it, point blank, it was just very exploitative. What was one of the questions was like, what was the darkest moment in your life, right? What was the worst thing that's ever happened to you? And this is like, a question you're supposed to be posing to people who, been on the street and have dealt with, sex trafficking, like very deep trauma, deep pain. And, it took several conversations for me to finally get it across that I was not going to be asking that question. I was like, to Black women and women of color who, who are terrified to even be in front of camera in the first place, to like ask them point blank.
And what was the response? What was like in that moment? Can you recall, like, I'm not sure if it was a phone call or if you were talking in person, like what did that person do?
It was via email, like I would take the questions off the list and then they would be back on in the next one. I was like, and then I would explain in an email, no, this is, what did I say? And then finally, I think when it ended up face to face, I had to use, get very strong in saying like, yeah, it's exploitive. Where, I had to give the philosophy of the line of my questions. I was like, I'm going to ask them what their hopes and dreams are. I'm going to ask them, I'm framing them as a hero. And I literally, I was like, you're going to get your tears, you're going to get your tears, but it's not going to be in the way you think, and that was one of the people who came after the interviews. Yeah, it's just like, wow, this is a, more generative, production shoot that I've ever been on. How did you do that type of thing? Because, I engaged with her as a human being, not a site of exploitation and suffering, suffer porn, so. And production wise, you know what I mean? Like one thing that I, did to set them up is like, I think we only filmed for maybe a half hour, but like those, every person was in that studio for about an hour and a half, just talking to them, getting used to the room, introducing them all the people in the crew, like people, that's this, and, most productions don't go through all that. It's like, welcome to our set, are you privileged enough to be comfortable? If not, too bad, they expect, a certain level of fear and sadness and discomfort. And maybe it's almost purposeful, but I find like, in terms of, having been, grown up, the way I did in white spaces, as often the only Black person in white spaces, I'm very acutely aware of how little respect can be afforded to people within white spaces. So that's what I mean in terms of production processes, fundamental processes. I flipped it by making it all about the subjects and not about our production timeline, getting them in and out. It's like, I think we only, we had to stretch it over like 3 days because we're spending so much time taking care of people in a way that is not automatically done in production.
I had a question about that because you have such a long experience of working in the industry. I was wondering what kind of, like, that's an amazing example of, the white gaze as it affects kind of all media. Coming up in the industry, and we talked before about you not kind of knowing anybody in the film industry. Like, were there some big hurdles that you had to climb across that, hopefully aren't there anymore? But are there those kind of things that are systematic in the industry that you came up across? Just trying to, I don't know if you were coming out, you wanted to be specifically in advertising or if you wanted to be more in episodic. And that might be a question is, did you kind of get pushed in that way if you wanted to start off in film?
That's an interesting question. It's something I really, again, like I said, that these questions are all so personal. I feel like, when they say the personal is political, I am the embodiment of that. Like, I feel like, it's very interesting to me to look back and realize, I didn't have, I wish I could have started, my step into media today instead of, 90, I guess it's 20, 30 years ago, right? When, cameras, you had to have I played around with Super 8 cameras, but if you, really wanted to make a film, you needed expensive video equipment, blah, blah, blah. So the whole process was a mystery to me. So, I felt like my only way in was through film school, right? And that's a very expensive thing, put me in debt from film school, all that stuff. That was an obstacle right there. Just the fact that my only access was to go into a film program that I would, I don't think is even necessary these days. And you know what I mean? And it's cost prohibitive and quite a burden, actually. And in that film school, I, even straight up in film school, I sort of, it's almost like systemically, I felt like, there was a lot of opportunity there, but it was almost like, sort of the white supremacist ideas sort of were weaponized within my fellow students and type of thing. It wasn't, I can't think of any purely systemic examples, but, I remember, one instance where, studios, were very on, schedule, out of respect. You only had, I think for our first project, you only had 6 hours in the studio, and then you had to be wrapped out, done, so the next student can get in. What do you know, the only person, who had to fight for her time was me. A fellow student, white guy, was just like, oh, I just need a few more minutes. Can I just take a half hour? Knowing that would be coming out of my time, felt completely justified in doing that. And had to, that's just one of, a few examples. And then once I got out of film school, I did not go into directing. I got that was my graduate degrees in directing, but I felt like there was no place for my voice. So I stopped, and that's when I pivoted into production. I was like, well, I'm a Black woman. I'm going to need to know how to produce anyway. I want to be empowered to produce. So I focused on getting work as a producer instead, and that ended up being my career. I was in that producing. So I think even the fact that I am a producer and didn't, leap out and make that leap of faith into directing, because I couldn't imagine it. It was big enough for me to have even made it into the film industry at all. Out of having had no background in it, no idea that it could even be a real job, that I still had to play it safe. And for me, playing it safe was like, oh, I'll produce other people's work. And, and of course in my mind, I rationalized like, oh, it'll be training for my own projects, which it ended up being, years later. But what I'm responding to in your question, Jeff, is that like, yeah, from the onset, like I limited myself based on what I saw out there. I mean, it was the time of, Harvey Weinstein and Quentin Tarantino. And, those were like, what is it, Greg Araki. And, there were no, I think, Daughters of the Dust had come out that year that I graduated, but like that was the first major film a Black woman had ever produced, from a production company that was not Black, so, or mainstream. And she hasn't made another movie since, I don't think, Julie Dash. So I saw some very real limitations and challenges of the time, and it definitely dictated what my choices were within the media. So from this space, who I am now with the whole different levels of experience and thought around the work, I'm stepping into a space, out of a different sense of possibilities. But like, yeah, that very much informed my entree into media.
Thank you for going through all of that, because I can definitely relate. I also went to film school, based off of like, it was something that I wanted to do, obviously, and I did see some reference, but to the point of what you're saying, you go, you get your degree, and then what? And then you navigate yourself, in whatever way, but it's still, yeah, like when you said it, when you said about the limiting part, I definitely felt that, because I did not go off and pursue my degree right away, and I guess there was another piece of accessibility that was a little, lost on me, or I at least couldn't figure out how to fully connect it. I'm sure also there's probably a little bit of intimidation that I had and wasn't all the way like aware of, or aware, like I didn't feel that in my day-to-day, but I'm sure it existed. And that was also why, I didn't pursue it in the way that I sought out at first. But everything I'm trying to say is like that, everything you said definitely resonated with me, and I appreciate that. And then I also would like to follow up with a question. Can you talk a little bit just about the technical side of being a producer? I've more recently have stepped into that role willingly and unwillingly, but there's some things that I definitely enjoy about it. And there are things I'm obviously still learning. And, with your breadth of experience, I'm just curious about some of the technical things that you bring to being a producer. Any tips, tidbits, whatever you want to share about being a quality producer, and even as they say, things you would have liked to know back then that you know now.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because like, yeah, I think, once film school was over, sort of like in terms of what I wish I knew then that I know now, is that like, we sort of dropped into, okay, go find your career, go find your job, and I wish I had sort of known a little bit more about how to network, and how to sort of, I think, and I guess that sort of alludes to, sort of finding your tribe, your like-minded people, finding a place of work. I think, resources like Open Signal are so huge, because I feel like I didn't have that when I came, even coming out of film school in LA. You think you have this, huge network of people. And I guess the sense you do with fellow filmmakers, but a lot of it, is still, it's not only mysterious, but small, I feel like one of the biggest things that I guess as a producer, I have found useful is sort of knowing the process, knowing how it all fits together, and knowing how much can go wrong. I feel like, I think a lot of people are really good about putting a plan on paper. Oh, that makes total sense. That's going to get done in a week. I think one of the most important things is knowing, especially the more technology is involved, like render file, just rendering something, or taking, back in the day, we'd have to take, film across town to get it developed or whatever, accounting for traffic, accounting for, stuff getting stolen, accounting for, a computer failure, accounting for, not getting files on time, like it says on your schedule. I think it's so important to just factor in a little bit of pad at every step, because that's reality. Nothing ever happens on time all the time. So there's so many times in which I feel like I've saved a project and saved my own ass just by already having factored in a little pad time to every deliverable, whether they're internal with my crew or client facing, and sticking with it and not letting people shave that time. And when people shave that pad, having them take responsibility for it, so that you can, charge the overage or whatever the appropriate amount is to cover that lack. Because I think a lot of times we're pushed as producers to make a plan make sense on paper, and then be the fall guy when that plan doesn't happen in that way. So that's like seriously a huge piece of advice I would give, and to sticking to those guns. I've had people say, well, that doesn't take that long to do. It's like, that's not what this is about. This is a schedule that we're trying to make. I'm trying to like deliver on the date you want, right? And another thing I think in terms of client relationships is like, just, whether or not one is the client-facing producer or the line producer working with another producer, always pushing for conversations and meetings. I think a lot of times people are really reticent about talking about things. They just want to go or not have meetings, especially creatives. No one wants to sit in a meeting. I feel like that's one of the biggest points of resistance I have, is like, okay, honoring that, right? Not wasting people's time at all, but always, having the backbone to like, sort of enforce the milestone checks that are required in order to keep things going smoothly. So like, communication and having a little force against the resistance that people have to be produced is really important. And that's why just starting from a mutual space of respect is super important, like making every person feel honored and heard. I feel like I've been able to deliver so many projects, more smoothly and with a little bit better spirit than most, just because, if I'm making a schedule, I really do show it to all the key players before I make it solid and firm with clients, And what's interesting to me in terms of when I talk about leadership styles, I feel like that's something I've gotten, not every time, of course, but like in some key, pretty consistently, I can get resistance around talking to my team about, whether or not a schedule or a budget or amount makes sense. I remember at one job, the owner of the company had the executive producer pull me inside and say, you shouldn't be going around to the department heads and asking them about the schedule. So, you tell them what to do. And so like my authority it didn't look like strong leadership to them for me to be vetting my plan with people. Strong leaders, this is that a top-down leadership style, I call it. When it's top-down, I feel like top-down leadership is so toxic. It's a setup for failure and disaster, because it's like, for top-down leaders, you look powerful, you look in charge if you're just dictating, if you're just going around dictating, what is to be done. I feel like, what really ensures success in media production and the real filmmaking process is everyone agreeing and being there and being allowed and creating a creative space for people who are good at their jobs to do what they do. So I want that creative director to have the proper amount of time to come up with that character design or those sets or whatever it is, I don't want to make a location scout find everything in 3 hours, because that's how, they fit into my budget, and have them scramble around stressed and feeling put upon. Because there will come a time where you're going to have to ask people for additional work. You're going to need a favor. You're going to need them like, actually the client, they agreed to everything last week. Well, now they don't want it anymore. And we have to come up with stuff from scratch. Can you do some weekend work? No, if they've been, whipped and beaten the whole time, and it's a top-down leadership style. So, I think it's very important to find a style and a collaborative way of working that works for, whatever your style is, but have it all be, vetted by your teams, so that like when you do need to flex and do the, sort of crunch time, toxic all-nighter that the process always requires, no one's feeling oppressed by it. It's like, oh, this is what we have to do. And I'm honored. They're not trying to, mess me over. This is just, what is required. And that's what we all do in production. So, I think those are like the key things beyond any technical aspects of knowing how to use, Basecamp or any kind of management program, or knowing how to record sound. It really is about asking questions and talking to the people who do that, and being able to be a leader who doesn't have to hold a whip in order to feel powerful or to be doing a good job. And it's such an interesting thing. That's why, in terms of my career, I find sometimes, going back to Fanya's original question about he was talking about, breaking the cycle and empowering Black people. I think a part of empowerment is to work in that way, even when I'm not appreciated within a system for acting in that way, It's very interesting too to sort of see, people who, who, let's say, under a different producer, maybe, everyone is staying up all night and it's very top down and people are miserable. That signifies to a lot of leadership, a lot of systems love that, because that shows you're doing a good job if your team is miserable, right? You're doing a great job if, people come, oh, I've been up all night. Yeah, I slept on the sofa, blah, blah, blah. That's like, oh, our team is working, But if, people are looking too comfortable or happy, blah, 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 I've literally seen people get a little ire up a little. They must not be working hard, So it's just very interesting. But I think it's also, just about finding your own style, but definitely creating room and planning in a way that even if it sort of bucks the system that you're working under, if you are working under, another system, you still maintain your own integrity in the sense of only representing what you think is realistic, and always padding for contingencies, because they always happen.
Thank you. I also want to be clear to everybody that if anybody in the room has questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, Jeff and I will just be asking Donielle lots of questions.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Mine's quick. My name is Jardima. I did not go to film school. I have no training. I'm literally at the point of just trying to get into Open Signal to dub my mini DV tapes onto digital. So I'm just grateful to be listening and learning. I know I have something to say, but I'm not even close to that. So thank you for including me in this group.
Well, thank you. Yes, sorry. I had a question. And I did not catch the first part of this. So I'm sorry if you've already spoken to this. But one thing that I've been trying to figure out, I guess for a couple of years, just is around pricing. When you are approached for a work, and just around licensing fees and just usage fees. And I've gotten some insight from a producer here who has helped me price things, but I want to know the information myself. And so I guess my question is,
YouTube is.
You said what? Okay, that was. Okay. Yes. So like my question is, how have you developed a sense of just of how to price a production, whether it's like all of the line items, like whether it's the creative fee or whether it's like the usage fee. I feel like each kind of production is different. And I am self-taught, and I haven't really had a have not really had had a lot of mentors in this field. So it's just been like kind of like learning as I go. And yeah, I mean, I would love to know, and I'm just wondering how you developed it. Has it been just through doing different projects, or yes?
I think I'm exactly where you are, doing different projects and learning as I go. I feel like I've learned everything I go, as I went, in terms of like pricing. It's willy-nilly. It depends, you know what I mean? Like, say I need to turn around a budget, and there's I know we're going to use stock footage, right? I'll sort of gauge, how much I sort of know from looking at royalty-free sites what kind of stuff is available, and I know from looking at like expensive sites like Getty or whatever. How expensive that can get. I'll take a sense of like what is required for the job is, or what the budget is, and I'll throw in a number that is like somewhere in between, and name that as like, hey, this is a line, this is a temporary amount, you know what I mean, that could go over if you require, X, Y, or Z or whatever. You don't really know until you're calling or inquiring about, rights as you go. That's something that is like, I think you're totally on the right track, and thinking that it really is something you have to learn as you go and put together through experience. You know what I mean? Like I always, just from knowing the range, the specifics always have to get worked out project to project. Even like the rates of like saying bringing out on an animator, they're going to be different in every state, right? Like, rates are very personal and based on experience. I know, like, back in the day, maybe a little less now, but like rates were a little lower in Portland, but in New York or LA, a lot higher if you were bringing on like an animator or a compositor or whatever. That's just getting on the phone, and maybe you know who you want to hire, right? And you can call them before you even put a number in, like, hey, how much would you charge for this, and what's your range? Knowing that you can, be flexible. You might be able to get a better rate if like, if it's negotiating a flat rate with that person. Okay. Like say, instead of charging by the hourly, are you comfortable with just giving us X, Y, and Z? And we'll just, and you can get this off your plate in one day, and you charge me a flat rate, which is under what it would take hourly if we were going to keep you on through the whole project. So rates are one of those things that like, I really wouldn't feel weird about like researching case by case, because it really is that there's so many factors, and I never feel like I know completely what a rate is from spec to spec. I know the range of costs, and and so I, if I'm like, for instance, if I'm doing a short video that's like 7 minutes and it's going to need some historical stills or footage, I'll throw in, and the budget is I don't know, say it's a $5,000 budget. There's probably not a lot we can afford on stills, right? So that would say 500 is the max we can spend. And so it's on me to be creative about finding sources, whether it's individuals who would, give me their stills, or, royalty free type of stuff or cheap stuff. So, it's really, I think experience is part of it, and also just calling and email, doing the research, because like it's not, I don't think, it's really about having all those numbers in your head to be an effective.
Okay.
It's just the legwork. Yeah. So, you're not at a disadvantage or doing anything wrong by having to like do legwork to find those rates. That's just part of the process for sure.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I would like to also add to that. I had a friend tell me, base it off of what you feel personally. Like if it's work you're getting hired for, base it off of what you personally feel like you should get paid. And I know that, as Danielle was saying, it's definitely a range. It's, personal determination. And one way, especially if you've been paid for this work in the past, maybe look at old rates you were paid by someone. Does that feel good to you? If not, of course, increase it or flex it however you think is appropriate. And then, yeah, also, like she was saying, negotiation is always a powerful tool because it can be an hourly or a flat rate, is appropriate. But it's always a variant. Project to project can be it varies. You can keep your rate as your standard for sure, but sometimes you find out you should have charged more, per the project, per the budget, because the budgets are always different, as well. So a lot of it is definitely personal choice, and then the research of what else, is out there, because per the budget, you might be able to get more than you think. And then some budgets are not always as big as you think. And sometimes you still got to say no because people don't want to meet you where you're at.
Yeah. And it's also, when negotiating rates with people you're bringing into a project, I find it's really useful to always, honor what they tell you in terms of what their rate is, right? Like, even if sometimes, there are circumstances where, I've had to ask people like, oh, my budget really doesn't accommodate that. I'm not trying to talk them down like, oh, well, that's, too much, or bring it down, but say, there are ways in which sometimes it's like, hey, but on the next project I bring you on, we'll bring you on your full rate. Are you comfortable? Especially if it's for a cause that people can believe in a lot of times too, that can help. But I think, there are times when, like, I tend to go to, like, I've got my cadre of people who, I already have a relationship. So oftentimes you'll find yourself being able to say, if you can't, do this rate, the next job I bring you on for will be full rate, or, plus some, or is there anyone else you can recommend who's maybe a little junior to you that, you think would come on for that rate? There's all kinds of flexibility in terms of, like, your negotiating power and the power of research too, that I think it's that flexibility and that conversation can take place without having to know off the top of your head.
Cool. Yeah, well, thank you both.
Sure.
Any other questions out there? Well, thank you so much, Danielle. I know I've taken a bunch of notes on this, and it's been great to hear your personal accounting of all this. So thankful you took the time to talk to us all.
Really, thank you for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Danielle. This was great, and I definitely look forward to hopefully meeting you in real life and doing this again.
You're here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jordima, I can email you about the dub rack thing.
Yep, I got to get back to dubbing.
Okay. Well, I'll email you about that.
Thank you kindly.
Of course.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh,
Bye.
pleasure. This was awesome. Tony Brown, this is awesome.
Good to hear you, Tony.
And New Year's to everybody.
Thank you. Same to you.
Thank you.
Yes.